There is a building in the American Southwest that has no right to exist. It sits at the bottom of a canyon with no permanent water source, surrounded by 4 hours of empty desert in every direction, and it is 600 rooms large. The walls are still standing. The astronomical alignments still work. On the winter solstice, the sunrise comes through a specific doorway that was placed there deliberately 800 years ago. The people who built it are gone. But here is the thing. The textbooks lied about where they went. They lied about who they were. And they lied about what happened inside those walls. Ancient DNA pulled from the bones buried beneath that floor has now confirmed every part of that. And the story it tells is darker, more specific, and more human than anything the official record was willing to say. The civilization is called Anasazi, a Navajo word that most Puebloan descendants find offensive, applied by outsiders to people whose names their descendants still carry. At its height, between 850 and 1150 AD, this was the largest pre-Columbian construction network north of Mexico. 150 great houses, roads 30 feet wide, wider than a modern 2-lane highway, running dead straight for miles across open desert, cut into bedrock, covering 90,000 square miles. An area larger than Great Britain, coordinated from a single canyon with no river and no obvious reason to be the center of anything. Pueblo Bonito alone had 650 rooms and stood 4 stories tall. The timber to build it came from mountains 60 miles away. The macaw feathers came from further south than that. And the people at the top of the system, the DNA now shows, came from further south than anyone had been willing to admit. The official narrative, built over a century of archaeology, was comfortable. The Chacoan society was egalitarian, peaceful. The great houses were communal structures used seasonally. The road network was ceremonial, maybe a pilgrimage route. The society was loosely organized and decentralized, something close to a pre-contact democratic arrangement in the high desert. And then, between 1150 and 1300 AD, they vanished. Drought, usually. Sometimes warfare. Sometimes the answer was left open because open felt more honest than wrong. What the official narrative never seriously engaged was the testimony of the Pueblo communities, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the Rio Grande peoples, who had been saying for generations that the story was more complicated, that there were outsiders at the top, that what happened at Chaco happened to their ancestors, not because of them, that their people did not vanish. They left. Ancient DNA confirmed all of it, and it confirmed something the oral traditions had always implied, but the academic consensus refused to follow. In 2017, geneticist Douglas Kennett at the University of California published results from ancient DNA extracted from 9 individuals buried beneath the floor of Room 33 in Pueblo Bonito. Room 33 is not an ordinary room. It is a carefully prepared burial chamber whose grave goods, turquoise jewelry, shell ornaments, ritual objects, dwarf every other burial context in the canyon by an order of magnitude. Archaeologists had suspected it was elite space. The DNA confirmed something more specific than that. The 9 individuals were all maternally related, connected through the female line, across what the researchers calculated as 9 generations. 9 generations of the same maternal lineage, buried in the same room, with the same category of exceptional wealth. That is not a coincidence of community burial practice. That is a dynasty. A matrilineal dynasty in which membership in a specific female line conferred, across 2.5 centuries, access to the material and symbolic resources that defined power in the Chacoan system. And that dynasty, by the way, is exactly what several Pueblo oral traditions had described. Not in genetic terms, but as a specific family, a specific line of authority that held Chaco and was eventually removed from it. The science and the oral record were telling the same story. The field had been listening to one and dismissing the other, but the more significant finding was not the dynasty itself. It was where the dynasty came from. The maternal haplogroup, the specific mitochondrial lineage of the Room 33 individuals, did not match the surrounding population. The wider Chacoan genetic sample, drawn from other burial sites across the canyon, showed the ancestry expected for people who had been living in the southwest for generations. The Room 33 lineage pointed somewhere different. When the researchers ran the comparative analysis, the signal oriented toward Mesoamerica. not a clean match to any single population. The data does not support that precision, but a directional signature that was statistically distinct from the local people and statistically closer to populations to the south, which is where it gets complicated. Because when you look at what was happening to the south in the 9th century, the UN precise period when the Chaco system began its rapid expansion, the picture comes into focus. Fast Teotihuacan had collapsed in the 7th century. The classic Maya were in terminal decline across the 8th and 9th centuries, with major centers depopulating and regional political authority fragmenting. What the collapse of large, hierarchically organized Mesoamerican states produces, historically, is diaspora. Elites, specialists, religious authorities, people carrying organizational knowledge and ideological legitimacy, moving out of collapsing centers and looking for somewhere to reconstitute their position. This is not speculation. It is a pattern documented across multiple Mesoamerican collapse events. What we are asking is whether some version of that movement reached the American Southwest. And here's the part that took the field 30 years of argument to accept. The material record says yes. Look at what was found at Chaco that does not belong there. Scarlet macaws, birds native to tropical Mesoamerica requiring specific temperatures and specialized diet, were kept in breeding colonies at Pueblo Bonito. Not feathers traded northward through exchange networks. Live birds, bred on site, whose bones show they spent their entire lives in the canyon. Copper bells cast in the Mesoamerican style, with no copper casting tradition in the surrounding archaeological record. Cacao residue in ceramic vessels at Pueblo Bonito, identified by W. Jeffrey Hurst in 2009 through chemical analysis. The northernmost documented use of cacao in the pre-Columbian record. A ball court at Wupatki, a formal engineered court for the Mesoamerican bull game, at an outlier site in what is now northern Arizona. A colonnaded facade at Chetroketl with no southwestern architectural precedent, and one filed tooth, front teeth deliberately shaped into a geometric pattern. A Mesoamerican marker of elite status, practiced nowhere else in the pre-Columbian Southwest, found on a single individual buried in exactly the context associated with the Chacan ruling class. Take all of it together, and what you are looking at is not trade. Trade produces a scattering of exotic goods that decline in frequency as you move from the center. This looks like a small, specific group of people arriving with ideological knowledge, architectural knowledge, and the material symbols of a Mesoamerican elite tradition, and establishing themselves at the top of a social structure already capable of organizing significant labor. Not refugees, not a mass migration, a deliberate movement of people with specific authority into a specific position. The matrilineal dynasty in Room 33 is the genetic trace of exactly that group, and the system they built was not peaceful. This is where the evidence becomes the hardest to carry, and where the descendant community frame cannot be separated from the forensic record. Without distorting both, Christy Turner was a forensic anthropologist at Arizona State University who spent over 2 decades examining skeletal remains from sites across the Chacoan landscape. His findings were professionally costly. His colleagues wished he would stop publishing them. He kept going because the evidence was what it was. Turner developed a 6-point forensic checklist derived from zooarchaeological standards for identifying processed animal bone and applied it to human remains to see what the pattern showed. The 6 indicators: burning patterns consistent with roasting rather than cremation, anvil abrasion, the scratching produced when bone is broken on a hard surface to extract marrow, cut marks in locations consistent with defleshing rather than burial preparation, pot polish, the smoothing produced when bone fragments are boiled in ceramic vessels, fresh fracture patterns indicating the bone was processed while still carrying tissue, and the systematic absence of vertebrae, suggesting the spinal column was processed separately. Every one of those criteria, Turner argued, appeared in combination, not in isolation, at multiple sites across the Chacan landscape. He eventually documented the full signature across nearly 300 individuals at dozens of sites, clustered in the geographic footprint of the Chacan outlier network and concentrated in the period of the system's maximum expansion. The question his skeletal analysis could not answer was processed for what? That question was answered in 1997 at a site called Cowboy Wash in southwestern Colorado. Not a great house, a small habitation site, pit structures, above-ground rooms, associated with the Chaco and Outlier Network. Excavations led by Brian Billman at the University of North Carolina recovered the remains of 7 individuals, men and women and children, showing the complete Turner forensic signature: burned, abraded, cut, polished, fractured, vertebrae missing, systematic and thorough. And left behind in the structure was a coprolite, preserved human feces, recovered from a location that stratigraphy placed inside the building after the processing had taken place. Richard Mahler, a biochemist at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center, recognized that if the remains at Cowboy Wash had been processed for consumption, the coprolite might contain a biomarker that no forensic ambiguity could explain away. He designed a test for myoglobin, a protein found in human skeletal muscle, chemically distinct from the myoglobin of any food animal in the prehistoric Southwest, and stable enough to survive in preserved fecal material. He published the methodology, the controls, and the results in Nature in 2000. Every result came back positive. Human myoglobin, in feces left inside the structure where those 7 people were processed. That is not a forensic inference or a reading of cut mark locations. That is a direct biochemical confirmation, and the geographic and chronological pattern of Turner's sites, clustered in the Chacoan zone, absent outside it, concentrated in the expansion phase, is not the pattern of endemic conflict or widespread regional violence. It is the pattern of a system. Turner's interpretation that the forensic assemblages represent a specific form of coercive violence used to enforce hierarchy within the Chaco network remains contested in its interpretive specifics. The pattern itself is not, and this is precisely where the Pueblo communities enter the record not as stakeholders to be consulted, but as historians who had the correct account all along. Their oral traditions describe Chaco as a place of control, outsiders who arrived and imposed authority, tribute demanded and extracted, a specific lineage that held power and was eventually left behind when the system collapsed. The distinction they have insisted on across generations of engagement with archaeology, that what happened at Chaco happened to their ancestors, not because of them, is what the converging evidence supports. The processed remains at the outlier sites were the people living at the periphery, under the system's reach. The violence was directional, from the center outward. The Room 33 dynasty was the perpetrating class. The surrounding population was something else, and when the system failed, they were the ones who left and survived and remembered correctly. The collapse came in the mid-12th century. Dendrochronology shows a severe, sustained drought beginning around 1130 AD, among the worst in the multi-century regional record. Tribute systems fail when the surplus they depend on contracts. The evidence from the outlier sites suggests the network began contracting before the central canyon itself emptied, which is exactly what you would expect if peripheral communities were withdrawing from a system they were no longer compelled to sustain. The roads stopped being maintained. The great houses stopped growing. The macaw breeding colonies ended. By 1300 AD, the central Colorado Plateau was nearly empty. The people went south and east. The genetic and material record of the Rio Grande Valley, the Hopi Mesas, and the Zuni Highlands shows population increase and construction expansion in exactly the period when the plateau was depopulating, with ceramic and architectural traditions continuous from the Chaconne sphere. The movement is documented. The destinations are documented. The people did not vanish. They reorganized, moved toward water, and rebuilt. The Hopi word for the people of Chaco, Hisatsinom, the ancient ones, carries no connotation of disappearance. It means ancestors, people who were, who became, who are continuous with the living. The Zuni oral tradition describes a controlling power that demanded too much and was left behind when the people chose to leave. The Rio Grande Pueblo communities describe a migration from the north and west consistent in direction and timing with the Chacoan depopulation. None of these traditions describe a mystery. None of them say their ancestors vanished. The mystery was produced by people who were not listening. Ancient DNA confirmed what was never actually forgotten, that the Pueblo people's ancestors built Chaco and survived what happened inside it. that the lineage in room 33 was genetically distinct from the surrounding population and its signal pointed south, that the forensic record of violence was systemic and geographically concentrated in the Chaco network's reach, that the collapse was not a disappearance but a series of decisions made across generations to stop sustaining a system that had taken more than it gave, and that the oral traditions describing all of this were accurate before a single ancient genome had been sequenced. The ruins at Chaco Canyon are still there. The winter solstice sunrise still moves through the doorway at Pueblo Bonito the way it was planned. And the descendants of the people who built those walls and endured what the people inside them demanded are still here. In Hopi, in Zuni, in Acoma, in the Rio Grande Pueblos, saying, as they have said for a very long time, that their ancestors did not vanish. It took ancient DNA and a myoglobin test and 30 years of institutional resistance to confirm what was never actually a secret. The oral traditions were right. The question worth sitting with is not why the civilization collapsed or where the genetic signal pointed. The question is why, with the correct account available the entire time from the people whose ancestors lived it, the academic world needed a laboratory to start listening. Before you go, drop a comment. Which part of this surprised you most? The genetics, the forensic record, or the fact that the oral traditions had it right all along?